What I'm hoping to do today is talk to you a little bit about my relatively short history, speaking up for the industry, and being a bit more public or vocal in my views, and hopefully through the chat at the end of the discussion to learn your experiences and your tips, so this can be more of a conversation than just a one-way flow. So with that, as Brent said, I am a veterinarian, although I haven't practiced sort of in traditional practice for a number of years. I operate an epidemiology consulting business that serves primarily the swine, beef, and poultry sectors. I've always had an interest in animal agriculture, being raised on a farm, but it was really as I graduated from veterinary school that I realized my passion or my real interest was in populations or intensive livestock production. So currently, I do live and work with my husband on the farm. He operates the grain side of the operation, and I'm more responsible for the cow-calf side. And it's really been that engagement or getting more involved in the farm that made me feel it was my place to start to speak up a little bit more. When I realized that my children, who are all in elementary school, knew more about farming than most of my neighbors who live in a small town in Saskatchewan, um, it it sort of highlighted that need that we aren't communicating what we do as an industry, and I think that that has a potential effect for what we for our future and our ability to make decisions to manage the land. Another part of my motivation, I guess, was that I see that a lot of the conversation that's happening right now on social media is coming from south of the border. And there's a very different tone and, frankly, quite a different industry going on in America than what we have in Canada. And I see a lot of the conversation that's happening down in the United States as being somewhat negative or hard-fisted and very much against, the big corporate agriculture. And I don't think that that's a sense of what we see going on in Canada. Even our largest corporations, many of them like Maple Leaf Foods, High Life, they're still family-owned businesses where the initial founder is still involved. And so instead of sort of that tone, I wanted to more extend sort of an open hand and give people an insider perspective on some of the Canadian agriculture things. And of course, my motivation, as I said earlier, is my children. All of them seem to know a lot about agriculture already at a young age. And I hope and anticipate that we can at least set up a farming operation that they'll have the opportunity to participate when they get older if they choose to. And that, of course, comes from having a sound financial plan and a sound farm, but it also comes from, again, having that social license to be able to continue to operate the farm the way my husband and I have had the privilege to do, where we really do have very minimal oversight. So that's a little bit on the background of why I got involved in this. What I try to do when I speak out for the livestock industry is I attempt at least to be very careful that I'm speaking about things that are relevant to me and that I do know about. So within my circle of influence, or my what I consider my circle of knowledge, is certainly dryland grain farming. I grew up on a grain farm, and my husband's been involved in that for over 20 years. Beef cattle is certainly well within my realm, in the swine industry. But when people come to me with questions about poultry or dairy, sheep, other industries, I try and refer those off to somebody who would know better, because one of the hazards I see about advocacy is that we do sort of overstep our knowledge or overstep our boundaries. And the areas that particularly interest me, that I really like to talk about, is my interest is really to talk to consumers, to food marketers, food retailers. It seems that we do an awful lot of talking to ourselves in the egg industry, which is great, because then we can go out and disseminate that message, and you sort of get that ripple effect. But when I'm talking sort of outside of the industry, I really do like to focus on the social responsibility pieces, the welfare, health, and how we manage health in the veterinary industry. And one of my passions is retaining our ability and our access to use new and novel technologies, and to sort of try and abate to some degree this fear of technology in agriculture. So enough about me and sort of what I'm about, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about what I consider 3 hot button issues. And for each of them, I'm going to follow a fairly similar format through. I'm not here again to teach you anything. I'm pretty sure there's people on the call that know more than I do about each and every one of these issues. So instead, what I want to do is talk to you about my process of how I went through sort of gaining the confidence to stand up and talk about some of these issues. where I may or may not be the expert. So full disclosure, I probably am considered among the experts for AMR because I have a PhD in specifically looking at the relationship between drug use and resistance in pigs. But when we're talking about something like methane or climate change in beef cattle, I am the average producer to maybe less as far as what I know. So that's why I picked these issues. So the first topic I'd like to talk about is gestation crates. And what I did when I started each of these hot button issues is, first of all, I just picked 3 to talk about, recognizing that there's many, many more we could talk about. And I went to Google because where else do any of us go for information? And I typed in gestation crates in Canada. And I wanted to start with some of the top stories that came up. So I didn't actually go searching and digging for negative media coverage. I'm just sort of presenting to you some of the information that came up. And it was really back in about 2012, 2013, when Canada was going through their code of practice revisions for the swine industry, that the gestation crate issue just exploded. So permit me for a minute to read to you a couple of the transcripts of these media. So the first one is on the Mercy for Animals website, and anyone who's familiar with Mercy for Animals recognizes that they are not a friend of agriculture. They have an agenda, but listen to these words, and this is coming from December 2012. A groundbreaking Mercy for Animals undercover investigation provides a shocking look into blatant animal abuse from one of the nation's largest pork producers. And at this point, I will leave out the names of any companies that were mentioned in this transcript. The investigator documented thousands of pregnant animals confined to filthy metal gestation crates so small that the animals are unable to even turn around or lie down comfortably for nearly their entire lives. Sadly, grocery giants condone confining animals in crates barely larger than their bodies by selling pork from producers who use gestation crates. These retailers have both the power and the ethical responsibility to reject this abusive factory farming practice by immediately adopting policies that require suppliers to phase out their use of gestation crates. So we're hearing some really strong language, and I don't think that should surprise any of us who knows anything about Mercy for Animals. But I think when you look further down and you see the type of language coming out of a supposedly unbiased media coverage like CTV-W5, we can start to see sort of the depth of how this issue is penetrating society. So Tom Kennedy reported again in December of 2012, just off a country road north of Winnipeg, the nearly featureless winter landscape of rural Manitoba, there's a series of nondescript barn buildings. The only hint of what goes on inside is a sign posted in the driveway that reads Highest Productivity Sow Farm. It's unlikely that anyone passing by would give the place, or anything like it, a second thought. Well, that may be about to change. And then he goes on to say, Canadians are not used to seeing this. They still believe that animals are raised in the old farm style. The reality could hardly be more different. The video shows what amounts to a living production line with thousands of pregnant sows, each held in a tiny metal stall where they will spend nearly 4 months of gestation. When they're ready, they're transferred to a slightly larger stall called a farrowing crate where they will give birth. After 3 weeks, the piglets are sent away for fattening and eventual slaughter, while the sows are returned to the gestation crates, re-impregnated, and start the cycle again. So when I read those transcripts, or even more touching yet, watch the videos, which I encourage you all to do, the coverage emphasizes to me that it is not an option for our industry to sit back and do nothing. When consumers watch something like W5 and they assume and believe that that's unbiased reporting, they believe that we have a huge issue, a huge welfare issue in our sow industry. We're using words like sadly, metal, abuse, thousands of sows, production lines, right? And these are words that have incredibly negative connotation, and any journalist that you speak with will tell you that the words matter. I couldn't find, even in, as I went through deeper and deeper and deeper through web searches, I couldn't find any images or videos or coverage of sows in modern barns with bright lighting. And again, twisted yet further, as we see with some of the negative coverage where the mood is dark, the lighting is dark, the music is eerie. We don't see any sort of the positive side of the industry. We don't hear people talking about the positive sides of sow crates, because anyone involved in the sow industry knows that yes, there's wonderful things about loose sow housing. There's also some challenges, and we need to talk about those. But I really do believe that in conflict, there always lies opportunity. And so I wanted to sort of delve into this issue and talk about it a bit further. So how I see us typically talking about issues like sow housing or other welfare issues that we see in the industry are, I see us talking in a very traditional, scientific, fact-based format. I see people talking about the 5 freedoms from thirst, hunger, from discomfort, from pain. But some of the problem with this is that, let's take one for example, freedom from pain, injury, and disease is what we consider a right of animals. But I think that can be interpreted so many ways, and it is interpreted differently based on people's experience. So instead of taking that traditional approach, what I try to do is I try and look at common values. So just a short interruption for a story here. This is stolen from a colleague of mine in Alberta who teaches at veterinary college the swine rotation. And this colleague, every time he starts a new swine medicine course, he asks the class to put up their hand. Have you ever been in a sow barn? 90% of the class says no, right? Have you ever read an animal welfare journal? Again, the vast majority of them have not. And yet if he asks them, do you believe that the swine industry has a welfare problem? Overwhelmingly, these veterinary students who presumably at least believe in some degree in animal agriculture say yes. And so again, this just reiterates my message that we can't sit back and say nothing. And if the traditional approaches or sort of the scientific facts aren't getting through to people or aren't resonating with people, how else can we talk about this issue? So this picture itself is borrowed from a publication put out by the Prairie Swine Centre based just outside of Saskatoon. But they talk about welfare, and this is based on work from Dr. David Fraser from UBC. And what this explains to us is that people see welfare from 3 different paradigms. Some people see welfare as an effective state where we're focusing on emotions like fear, pain, discomfort. Other people see welfare as a functional thing. So they think that if the sow is productive, if she's getting rebred, if she's able to wean large litters, if the growers or the nursery pigs are having a good average day of gain and feed conversion, that all of those functional things must indicate that there's good welfare. And the third paradigm of how we see welfare is based on, are animals able to exhibit the behaviors that they would naturally in the wild or in the environment without human intervention. But what this shows us is that part of our problem when we talk about sow crates and welfare is that we're each coming at it from these different paradigms. And what we need to do as an industry is sort of stop and look and see which management practices overlap and where can we find that core that we're sort of meeting all of these paradigms. And I think for me, just this Venn diagram that the Prairie Swine Centre put out made me realize that this is part of the problem, is that we're each talking in our box, and those boxes don't necessarily reflect how somebody else sees it. So the way I decided to sort of be an advocate, I guess, if you want to use that word about this, is I tried to look for what is the root common value that both the people who are concerned about the practice in agriculture have with what I believe. And I think for sow crates, one of the concerns is that these sows be free of pain. So when I hear people talking about sows being in pain from confinement and not being moved around, or being able to move around, what I try to do is, instead of debate them and discourage their point of view, I try to explain to them the other side of the story, that yes, these sows can't move around, but when we allow them to freely interact with each other, we have problems with bullying and fighting. And so the crates are a management tool which allow us to protect sows from what's really the ultimate playground, and we all know that girls can be mean, right? Is that's a tool, and to try and explain to them that it isn't black and white, but that there's many shades of gray, and ultimately all of our objective is to prevent these sows from feeling pain. So one of the other common values that I think I see with sow crates is when I hear people talking about production lines and thousands of animals and factory farms and all those really negative connotation words about intensive agriculture. My concern is, I think that they believe that in getting more and more and more animals, we're giving up our responsibility to care for the individual. And so, yes, crates do allow us to have large number of sows on a single site, but we can do that with loose sow housing as well. And I guess it's having that conversation that in the industry, using crates has helped us to go into a system where we were able to give individual care, individual amounts of feed, monitor vaccination, monitor pregnancy status on an individual basis to sows every single day, that they then start to understand that just because they're metal or just because they're in a long row doesn't necessarily make it a factory farm. So it's really trying to dig down and look for that common value that, yes, as an industry, we do care. It is our responsibility to care. And I firmly believe that any producers who are out there that have stopped caring really need to question their motivation for being in agriculture, in livestock agriculture, because there is lots of other industrial things that they could put their skills to. So I believe that producers do care and that we need to talk about that. And, you know, I guess part of my other mission for this webinar today was to explain or share, I guess, a little bit of where I find information, because we're not all the experts on everything, right? I do not purport to be the expert on gestation crates, but my information sources for this were several of the provincial pork boards have excellent websites. They all have animal care coordinators that are available for a phone call. Canada has come up with a national sow housing project that has an excellent website. Prairie Swine Centre I already referenced, and of course Canada's Pork Code of Practice came out a couple of years ago, and so that gives us some very good information. But the other place that I went to was to a producer himself. So I had the opportunity last month to tour a barn where there's both loose sow housing and crates in the same operation, and speaking with that producer who's living both systems every day, who sees the pros and the cons of each system and sees the need and the value where each fits. That's what really brought it home to me, how to pull this together. And so it emphasizes that we don't all need to be experts on this, but there are so many people living this every day that have the knowledge and the passion and the ability to speak up, that's really where we need to start, you know, flooding the internet with some positive stories, so that when I Google things like sow crates in Canada, Mercy for Animals is not what pops up to the top, but maybe it's a Canadian Pork Council story, or maybe it's a story by an individual producer. So the next hot button issue that I'd like to talk on, switching gears a little bit and switching industries, is climate change and beef production. And the reason I picked this topic is because a couple of weeks ago, I received a phone call from a journalist, actually a journalism student, who wanted to come out to my farm and interview me about climate change in the beef industry. I'm going to be honest here. Initially, I froze because I went, I don't know anything. And then I stalled for a while, and then I reluctantly said, yes, I guess you can come out to my farm. And so this is going to run you through some of the background and the preparation that I tried to do to prepare for that. So again, please let me permit you to read the story that came to the top of my Google search when I typed in climate change and beef cattle. If you want to slow climate change, white meat may be the right meat, according to two studies that tally the environmental effect of the beef industry. Raising cattle in the US, so again, it's American, not Canadian, requires 28 times as much land and 11 times as much irrigation water, and pumps at least 5 times as much planet-warming gases into Earth's atmosphere than producing the equivalent calories of dairy products, poultry, pork, or eggs. From 1961 to 2010, worldwide emissions of planet-warming gases from livestock increased by 51%, with the bulk of the increases coming from developing nations that are rapidly adopting the US model of meat consumption. For people, the obvious answer is, I love this, whenever possible, replace beef with something else. If you really need it to be from an animal source, that's okay. You can still have bacon and eggs whenever you want. As long as it's not beef, you've made a significant step forward, because beef is so much more intensive than the rest. Okay, so that was the first story I came across, and that one clearly highlighted to me that given that a part of my livelihood rests on raising beef cattle, staying silent and not getting engaged clearly wasn't an option. But more to the point, I mean, I operate a grain farm too, so maybe I should be encouraging everyone to eat lentils and chickpeas, right? I can produce those as easily as I can produce beef. But you and I both know that that would be far from the most environmentally responsible thing to do. That in many cases, beef cows are on that land because they are the only productive thing that can be on that land. So when I sort of went to do my diagrams or of the words that are out there, things like manure, climate, irrigation, global warming emissions, this one was a lot easier than the gestation crates to find some warm and fuzzies on. I mean, we can talk about riparian zones, we can talk about grassland management, about species at risk, about the prairies, about conservation. But the problem is if you really dig down into these issues, having cattle out grazing on grass isn't really the solution to the methane gas problem. So now what on earth was I possibly going to talk to this journalism student about? So I, again, went to try and find some resources on the internet, and I found both the global and the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And I thought that their vision and their mission statements were very insightful. You can read them for yourself. But again, I think that these are a bit more like explaining some of the 5 freedoms of welfare. People have an attention span of about 0.3 nanoseconds these days. And on top of that, I'm not sure that a mission statement like envisioning a world in which all aspects of beef value chain are environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable, I'm not sure that resonates with the consumer because they say, yeah, but what are you doing today? So I didn't feel that the traditional messages worked quite as well as I was hoping they would. And so I fully admit that I did walk into this interview somewhat unprepared, which is not really how you want to meet the media. But I asked this young journalist student, who I'm going to peg her in her mid-20s, and she openly admitted to me that she was from the city and knew little about agriculture. I said, "Do you know what beef cows eat?" No, she didn't really know. Do you know what the alternative use is for this land if these cows if we choose to not graze cows on these land? Well, no, that hadn't really, she hadn't thought about that. And then I said, is there a problem with the beef environmental sustainability? Well, maybe not on your operation, but yes, there is. And she starts quoting, FAO reports and about the long shadow of beef. So this to me is a little bit like realizing with my colleague and his veterinary clients that people are engaged in these issues, they're concerned and they're interested, but they're coming at it from a different perspective than us. So what are the paradigms or the perspectives that we think about when we talk about environmentalism or sustainability? And again, this comes from the Global Roundtable, but they break it down into there's environmental sustainability, there's social sustainability, which involves jobs and communities and people, and there's economic sustainability, because again, if we can't make money as an industry, we won't be here. And most of us involved in the beef industry at least are part in it for altruistic reasons, for feeding the world. So instead of talking about each of those pieces individually, again, as an industry, we need to find what are those touch points, what are those values or messages where the Venn diagram comes together and everything overlaps. So for me, it comes down to a pretty simple message of cows eat grass. Okay, that's a little bit of a simplification. They eat forage, as you and I both know, but cows eat grass, right? That seemed to me as a message that we could talk about. And what I focused with this journalism student on was that, I wanted to focus on my farm. I didn't want to debate feedlots. I don't want to debate what's happening in developed nations. I want to talk about what's going on in my farm. So when she asked about emissions, instead I talked about our feed source and the wasteland that this would have. And when she asked about the ecosystem, I talked about soil health, and I talked about land use and minimizing erosion. And when she talked about manure, I flipped it around and I talked about watershed protection and riparian zones. And yeah, it might have been a little bit political, but instead of trying to focus on just methane, what I tried to do was explain to her that climate change is only one of a whole host of of environmental issues that we manage on our farm every single day, many of which are much more tangible and real right in front of me. And so that's what I tried to work through with her. And of course, you have to talk about the issue to some degree, but I really did try and explain that really industry should only settle for a win-win. And that the win for everyone is if we get more and more efficient production, more and more efficient cattle, and that a growing industry allows us to bring innovations through genetics and technology to play where we can continuously adopt practices that allow us to do that. So what are the values that I think we share? I think that the environment has to come first, and I apologize to a few people if your formatting is off on this. And yeah, the environment comes first, but if you actually dig deeper, what's the true root of their motivation? It's that the people of tomorrow come first, right? It's that we don't harvest the resources of the earth today to the extent that the people of tomorrow won't be able to survive. And I think that's a very common value between producers and consumers. So they argue that beef's proportion of our resource use is unacceptable. But I think that we have an equally sound message that needs to be heard, that beef turns wasteland and waste grass into high quality protein that feeds the world. And when they talk about the emissions that are coming from the beef industry, you know, I think, yes, we do have a methane issue that we need to take seriously. But at the same time, beef sustains grasslands. Grasslands are a carbon sink. We are sustaining those watersheds and those species at risk. And so talking about that broader issue. And again, just a list of some of the information sources that I used to go into that interview. So the third hot button issue that I want to talk about is antibiotic use. And so, you know, I've now touched on two issues where I was caught in situations that I had to speak about them publicly and felt unprepared. Antibiotic use for me is a little bit different in that I do have an educational background on this topic. I did my PhD looking at the relationship between use and resistance in the hog industry. So I do have an interest in this. But I didn't actually develop my passion about antibiotic resistance until I had a personal experience. A few years ago, when my oldest son was 5, he contracted bacterial meningitis and he was very ill. And when he was hospitalized and put on IV antibiotics, I, of course, went and looked to see what he was on. And I realized that the family of antimicrobials being used to treat my son were the same products as are used in the hog industry, at that time in the poultry industry, and in the beef industry. And I knew scientifically, unemotionally, that the use in the livestock industry had no bearing or weighting on the efficacy of that product in my child. But irrationally, it didn't matter. Suddenly it struck home. I understood why people were so fearful about our use of antimicrobials in the livestock industry, because when you have that loved one in the hospital under care, and then you hear media coverage that talks about the use of these products in livestock and how that potentially is going to make them ineffective in your loved one, it became very immediately clear to me why people were against us using antimicrobials in the livestock industry. And so that stimulated me to speak up a bit more. So for the third time and my last, permit me just to read to you one of the publications that came to the top of my Google search. A cow can get penicillin without a prescription in most parts of Canada, unlike humans who have to see their doctor first. Farmers can simply go down to the local farm supply store and buy tetracycline and many other antibiotics over the counter. And the animals don't have to be sick. Cattle, chickens, turkeys, and pigs take antibiotics to prevent them from becoming infected. For animal producers, antibiotics are an important management tool to keep their herds and flocks healthy and profitable. But it's estimated that up to 80% of the world's antibiotics are used in agriculture. Every time a bug comes up against a drug, whether it's in humans or animals, that's a fresh opportunity to evolve a new defense. And the links are now clear. Antibiotic use on farms is creating superbug infections in humans. The World Health Organization warns that unless antibiotic use is reined in, the world is heading for a dystopian future where routine infections are deadly. So, you know, when I look at the buzzwords there's a lot of negative words. Death, using antibiotics to fatten your animals, superbugs, over the counter, don't have to be sick. And the positive words, again, those stories are a lot harder to find. You have to dig to find stories that focus on stewardship, that focus on One Health, veterinary oversight, animal welfare. And so how do we talk about this issue? How do we get past the fear mongering and the buzzwords and really get, and the media spin, and get down to the root cause? And like climate change, our best approach to manage antimicrobial resistance in the livestock industry is to sort of minimize our footprint or minimize our impact while we wait for new rescue technologies to come and solve the problem. But like climate change, at what cost? To what extent should individual producers change the way that they're managing or practicing on their farm? And to what ultimate effect on these huge global issues that we're facing? So when we look at how this is traditionally spoke of, I pulled this off of the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association website. We talk about veterinary oversight, and I'll admit I'm a veterinarian. I'm biased, clearly, in my support for veterinary oversight. We can debate that in the chat afterwards. But when I see these traditional messages, I think the thing that strikes me is that, again, just like the 5 freedoms from welfare, just like the Global Roundtable for Sustainability mission statement, I don't think that these resonate with consumers. I think these are important conversations that we need to be having internally as an industry, but I don't think that these are the types of conversations that work for externally. Instead, we need to look at what are the paradigms. Why do we use antibiotics in the industry, and why are we concerned about resistance? Well, we use them first and foremost to protect animal health, and I think that that's a key message we need to get across, that we're not just using them for growth promotion. In fact, that's sort of gone by the wayside by the end of the year. We're using them to maintain the welfare of our animals, and that's one of our responsibility. Animals get sick, and it is our responsibility to provide them with treatment and care when that happens. I think it's also important to touch on the food safety issue, right? So we look at all the negatives of it, the potential of resistant bacteria on our meat, but what about the negatives of sending unhealthy animals to slaughter? And the fact is that antibiotics do keep animals healthier. And I think, again, finally, focusing on the One Health issue. For too long, medicine and veterinary medicine have sat on opposite sides of the table and pointed their finger at each other and blamed each other. And instead, we need to recognize this as a One Health issue. There's global consequences. Anyone who uses antimicrobials has a responsibility to do so responsibly. And we all reap the benefits of good stewardship and face the consequences of poor stewardship. So again, this is another issue where we need to find where those values crossover in the Venn diagram, and where we can find those core values that resonate with many consumers. So one of those, in my mind, is that food must be safe. And we hear from consumers and from people who market raised without antimicrobial meat that the risk of using antimicrobials in livestock is unjustifiable. But we need to communicate as an industry that it's a very long way from the farm to the fork, that there's regulations over controlling how and when these are used. There is no antibiotics in Canadian meat, milk, and poultry, and that these regulations are tightening up, and that's a good thing. So we need to really put this risk in perspective, that it's really much, much smaller than people think it is. And of course, the concern is that antibiotics are a non-renewable resource, and that once their efficacy is used up, it is gone. And that's a value that producers should resonate with everybody as much consumers, because it is going to be a dismal day when I have infections in my cattle that I can't treat, and where euthanasia is the only option. So just like sick people need medicine, I think our values are exactly the same. Sick animals need medicine. And so it behooves all of us to practice optimal stewardship, to minimize the pace of resistance developing. It's still going to happen, it's still going to be there, but minimize it and prolong and preserve the efficacy of antibiotics. And I think when you talk to consumers in that way, they say, oh, yeah, you're probably not using them just willy-nilly and sprinkling them on their food like sugar on the cornflakes, because they understand that you've got skin in the game too, and you've got something at risk when resistance emerges and develops. So those were the 3 hot button issues that I chose to talk about. And just to wrap up a little bit, I think that in agriculture we have a lot of challenges. I believe that each of us personally who are in primary production, one of the things that we can do is to make sure that there's nothing that happens on our farm that we're not willing to talk about. Now, that doesn't mean it's an easy conversation, because there's a lot of ugly things about farming and about agriculture. There's a lot of, I mean, let's face it, if you have livestock, you have dead stock, right? Sickness, illness, the environment, they're not always easy conversations, but we should be willing and open to have those conversations. And I think as an industry, for each of these issues, part of the reason that I picked them is I think each of them, there is an issue there, and there is room for constant and continuous improvement. And I hope that, you know, 30 years from now, when I'm watching my kid or your kid give a webinar to teach me something, I hope we look back at the way we did things in 2015 and we do think it's archaic. Because I do think that the industry has all sorts of potential to move ahead, to develop and use new technologies. But in the meantime, we need to retain that social license to be able to do so. So my approach to advocacy and to communicating is really to try and keep it personal, to try and talk about the things that are within my sphere of experience or knowledge, or something that I feel that I know about. I try and be sincere about what I'm talking about. I'm not into big, you know, promoting and talking about things for other people or whatever. They're really issues that touch my heart. And I really do, when I'm speaking out, I try and seek out the common ground and the common themes, rather than debating a point. It's let's find the common core value and then talk about why we might differ there, instead of debating why the other one's wrong. It does concern me that there's a lot of negative advocacy, particularly on social media, and a lot of it is American, but there's some of it is Canadian. And I don't think that's doing any of us any good. And it is a risk of getting involved in this, because people can be very negative and attacking sort of on Twitter or Facebook. But really, we need to seek that common ground, and we need to be talking, in my mind, we need to be talking to the movable middle. There's always going to be animal welfare activists. There's always going to be extremists. There's always going to be people on that far end of that bell curve that we are never going to influence. And that's not who we're trying to talk to. We're trying to talk to all of the people that they're trying to influence. But we need society in general to understand sort of the value of Canadian agriculture, the stewardship and the experience and the professionalism that goes into raising the food, not only that they eat, but that goes and is exported to feed the world. So I often feel a little bit like this baby. I'm an infant at this advocacy thing, and it can be really exhausting and overwhelming at times, and then you have your day job to try and get done. A lot of the things I struggle with is, should we be proactive or reactive? The gestation crate's a great example. So that issue has largely died down since Canada's Code of Practice came out. Should we even be stirring the pot? Should we be out there talking about it? But if we in agriculture, and many producers still have gestation crates, if we don't get out there and talk about it, who's driving the media agenda? Who's driving the topics? They are, and we're constantly defending and reacting. And then it sort of makes your personal story or your response seem, I don't know, it takes the value away, as if you come out and you talk about how you raise your animals and how things happen on your farm without that sort of that need to respond. One of my other fears is that no one will listen. And the thing that I've realized from that is a lot of producers think they have nothing to say until you go to the curling rink or the coffee shop and you realize the depth and the wealth of the experience of people in every sector of the industry. And what they forget is that they're the expert in their industry. And me on the outside, you know, when I'm talking to a dairy producer, I feel like an absolute moron because you don't know things. Industries are so technical, and not everyone wants to do webinars or write blogs, but I think we can all talk to the person in the grocery store, or the, you know, shake a hand at church, or maybe go to a local school group. So in my mind, there's many different forums, and they don't all have to be the same. One of the other fears, particularly when you're working with journalists, is that your message will either be misunderstood or twisted, and I always struggle with that. And that, in my mind, is one of the beauties of sort of this advocacy approach, is that initially when you start out on social media, you're communicating outward, as opposed to having media come to you and sort of grill you with questions that you're not prepared for. And so to some degree, you control the message, and you can control who and how you respond to. and I think that's real positive. I know in Saskatchewan we have training for producers through the Real Dirt on Farming with Farm and Food Care, and I believe that's available in Ontario too. I mean, opportunities like that are wonderful to build your confidence, to speak out about the industry and to promote what we do. And of course, is this a benefit or a consequence? Because I have people in the industry debate me a lot of the time. They say, you need to just shut up, right? You're just stirring the pot. You're just telling them things they didn't know, and now they're going to ask a bunch of questions. But, you know, when I look at the media coverage and I think of the fact that every single one of us has employees walking around our farm with professional level recording equipment on their iPhone, I don't believe that we can just shut up. And so there is a consequence, or there is a risk for any one of us misspeaking or not representing the industry in what we say. But my hope and my goal is that by hundreds or thousands of us speaking up and flooding blog sites and social media with positive messages about agriculture, that any one of us misstepping slightly is sort of consumed in this vast, overwhelming positive message about agriculture, instead of, you know, just a few lone voices in the dark. And you know, it all comes back to what is my motivation and why do I do this? And increasingly, the negative media coverage just seems to grow every month and every year, and I think it needs to be countered, again, for that future generation, and for our ability to use the resources that we've been entrusted with in the responsible way that we know, and bring that professionalism to farming that we can, without having undue oversight and regulation from people who are disconnected from our industry. So with that, thank you for your attention, and if we have time, I'll certainly invite any questions that come my way.
Thanks, Leigh. There's been a couple of questions that have come up through. I appreciate your personal walkthrough. You come with great experience, but I'm sure there's pressure on you as well because of the kinds of experiences you've had. There's one question about, you mentioned animal welfare journals. Is there a reputable source there, or is there some specifically that you'd reference?
Right, and I don't have specific ones that I reference, but the one trick or tool that I have that's free, we all have access to. So go into Google and type in your question, and you know, all of the hits will come up, and then hit Google Scholar and type in the same keywords. And generally, the information that comes up through Google Scholar will be peer-reviewed journals that come up they're reputable, and so you can sort of, it gives you a nice foil for, this is sort of what the consumer media messaging is, and this is what the scientific community is saying about things. So I think that that's a really good point that we can all do for, you know, even if you don't have access to a university library or something, that Google Scholar can give you that really good balance.
Excellent. There's one question here that I can answer, and that will be that these recordings are posted on the Farm Management Canada site after the fact. It takes them a little bit while to archive them, but they are available to people, and that was a question that came up. You know, I was thinking, as you were as you said, you're challenged to be asked questions sometimes. Can you sort through, when people are asking you questions, whether they're intentionally a troublemaker or whether they're genuinely interested in your answer? And how do you make sense of, you know, whether you're in for a fight or whether this is just a great sharing opportunity?
Yeah, I think you get that gut feeling, that sense pretty quickly. And my personal experience is that 95+% of the people that come up to me in person or contact me directly through email or that type of thing, they are sincerely interested. Almost never are the troublemakers going to go to the effort to put themselves out there in that one-on-one communication. Social media can be a little bit different, and it can also be a lot trickier, particularly Twitter. I struggle with. Twitter's got amazing reach, but it's so short that people's, you know, the connotation or the context can be lost in what they're trying to do. But I did have a really interesting experience on Twitter recently. So I was at a conference for swine veterinarians, and we were hosting a session on antimicrobial resistance, and I was tweeting out some of the statements that the speakers were making, and I had this one guy come in and, you know, just start twisting my words and how awful it was we were using these products in the swine industry. And for those of you who are on the farm, you've all seen the hawk flying around that's being bombarded by like 17 sparrows going behind it. It was these people on Twitter that I don't even know came to my defense and just like took this guy down with all of these positive messaging. And so, yeah, there are people out there that we're not going to change. And my personal policy is to disengage. I am not going to get in a fight on social media with someone. But, you know, in general, my experiences, they are few and far between. And the number of sincere questions and comments I get, they've got to be 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 versus the troublemakers.
Excellent. Your reference to young journalists or even experienced journalists, how do we make sure, or at least prime the path so that appropriate questions are coming to somebody like you instead of Google? How do we direct people to the personal connection where, you know, you talked about this framing things in a common core value. You know, there's lots about journalism that doesn't do that. How do we pave that path? Or do you have some thoughts?
I guess a couple of my experiences of late. So one example was that CTV put out a very negative piece right after Christmas on AMR and really kind of connected it in a very twisted way to the beef industry. I attempted to contact CTV directly and that met with nothing. But you know, it was really interesting. A blog on social media really got their attention. And so sometimes it's just, again, responding to those negative pieces. And the interesting that came out of that was that CTV decided to have a meeting, not only with myself, but also with Saskatchewan stock growers and their ag journalists to build that relationship. Well, what a win, right? That's wonderful when we can do that. And moving forward, they now know those people to call. I think another thing that each of us, doesn't matter what industry we're in, we all have provincial and national associations that represent our producers. Those associations, in my mind, should have a list of people for every hot button issue that they could give to a journalist that would be a reputable source and somebody who would reflect sort of the industry's perspective on something. And then I think that makes it, let's face it, journalists have a lot of work to do and they don't necessarily have time to make 17,000 phone calls to find someone. One phone call to the industry association and be referred on to a producer, I think journalists would catch on to that quite quickly. So those are a couple of the techniques and tools that I've been trying to use lately. But if somebody wants to put out a twisted and a biased story, I don't think there's anything we can do. I think our only recourse is to, again, being proactive and putting out positive messaging as well.
Okay, appreciate it. We welcome other people's questions as they come in here, and please, if you've been thinking about it and you haven't typed it in, do that now, because we certainly have some time to work with here. I have another question myself, and that's, you spoke about that emotional response you had to your son requiring an antibiotic, and because you know you could make the connection to say that's of the same family group, and even though there's no technical relationship, you know, that's proven in any way that it took your breath away. I mean, for lots of us who would recognize good science, how do you manage even if a slight risk like that one?
Yeah, you know, risks, sorry to interrupt you, risk management is one of the huge challenges that we face in agriculture. And one of the things, so as an epidemiologist, I do stats all day long and I think in probabilities, but you know, I think producers do too. Is it going to rain? Is it not going to rain? What's the chances that the crop's going to need to be sprayed or not sprayed? You know, what's my pre-weaning mortality going to be? We think in numbers and probabilities, and consumers don't. Consumers think in black and white. And that's a conversation I've had with public health. You know, what degree of risk is acceptable? And they tell me 0. Well, we all know there's never zero risk, right? There's risk every time I get in my car and drive down the highway. So I think to some degree it's communicating to people the understanding, because when you don't understand a risk, it seems infinitely more frightening. So most of us don't walk around being terrified of dying of a bee sting or being struck by lightning. And some of these risks related to agriculture are in those same odds, right? So it's up to us to communicate, not only, don't worry about there's no risk, but help them to understand the scientific foundation for those who sincerely want to.
Yeah.
That's sort of my approach.
Interestingly, in a world full of so much communication and information overload, how do we deal with the consumers who say, I don't even really want to know, I just want what I want, even if it doesn't make, I don't care whether it makes scientific sense or not. I've just decided, and it's my wallet, so give me what I want. And really aren't all that interested in what that means for the betterment of the economy or other people. They're just convinced and locked in.
Yeah, if anyone's got a quick, easy answer to that one, I'm all ears. You're right, it's hard. How do you, and I guess that's what I was going at with those quick circles is, how do I get a value statement across to people in 20 seconds or less? But millennials, although they get criticized, I see the question actually uses the word, are they lazy in their learning? They get criticized, but boy, they're as cynical and they are a consumer that grew up being marketed to, and they're not stupid. They know when they're being marketed to. They know. I was at a conference and I there was a young man, I'm going to say early 20s, stood up, and he said, Chipotle's ads, you think we don't see through that? We're not that dumb. We see through this stuff. And I thought, oh, okay. So maybe we can say that they're lazy, or maybe they just consume messages in a different way, and we need to just be putting out more sound bites. And eventually they'll have enough appetizers that they'll be ready to come and hear the main course. I don't know. It's always easier to communicate with people of a like experience of yourself. I think that's part of why producers struggle to communicate with people from the city, because we've got that different perspectives or whatever. So maybe just getting more people advocating that are in their early 20s, I think that they will resonate much better than someone like myself will.
Okay. And speaking of being marketed to, I think, A&W certainly has a campaign around marketing an ideal around food, whether somebody thought about it before or not. After they see those ads, they go, oh yeah, I want some of that. How do we have a responsible response to a mega campaign that large?
Yeah, fantastic question. All of our industries spend a lot of money marketing our products internationally to export them to build international markets, which is a huge part of what keeps us all in business. But maybe we need to be looking at spending money on national campaigns to support our product. I don't know. A&W, I was at a presentation by their VP, and she said it is not our job to tell consumers what they want. It's our job to give it to them. But when you looked at the questions that they asked consumers, they were incredibly leading. And so we have to recognize that food retailers are in this to make their brand distinct and unique. A&W, let's admit it, they've done an absolutely fantastic job of that, as has McDonald's from a completely different approach or bent, and kudos to McDonald's on that. But maybe it's our time as an industry to, again, just stand up and be more vocal, so that consumers can say, oh, maybe I am just being marketed to. Maybe I should be a little bit cynical here. What's the real story?
I guess there's a part two to that that's, your earlier discussion was about the strength of a personal story and how that makes a connection with people to go, oh, that's how you do that on your farm. And as you get to a broader industry discussion or a well-funded industry discussion, the millennials, their skepticism perks up and goes, boy, the people are throwing a lot of money at telling that story. you know, if it's funded by a multinational company to say food's safe, you know, it's almost counterproductive. Is I'm not sure what the split is there. If you have some thoughts about how that works.
No, I think you're right. I think that's where we've seen such strength and such great gains in just personal stories on Facebook and Twitter and social media. And I think they've done as much or more to connect with consumers than we saw in the past. I mean, the Subway coming out with their Raised Without Antibiotics, or with their No Never campaign in October, and the backlash from producers that immediately made Subway back up and say, whoa, we have overstepped. That was huge, right? That shows the power of us collectively speaking out as individuals. And I think we do have that power. And I think, yeah, this personal story really does resonate. And we also have the ability, you know, I speak only for myself. I don't represent anybody. And so when I misspeak, the consequences are on me. Industries have to be incredibly careful about how they speak, and that often hinders them from either having a timely response or from having what comes across as a sincere response. So again, I really do believe that the more of us that speak up with our own message, it doesn't even have to be positive. Maybe we talk about the negatives, because cynical people will see through continually positive messaging. I think it's just getting out that this is how it actually is done on the farm.
You spoke about framing the gestation crate issue, that if you figured a lot of it out after you visited a farm that had both. And I'm curious about you going into that a little further, because, you know, this idea of hogs would be mean to each other, and I'm not sure everybody buys that or understands it. Can you maybe give a little more explanation of how you frame that if somebody asks you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we idealize how animals live on farms. And if you haven't had the opportunity to be on a farm outside of your sector, because you can think you know lots about agriculture, but you know, it is very humbling to go onto farms of completely different livestock species. It's humbling. But sows, they are aggressive. They are bullies. There is a pecking order. And the producers who have successfully gone to loose sow housing have had to learn how to manage that natural behavior, which we're trying to encourage, but how to manage that so it's to the benefit of all in the group. And I think it's just really painting for people who are interested in hearing about it, that it's shades of gray, that there are some sows that this is much better for, and there's some that it's probably not, and that there is no perfect win-win. But it was really being on that one farm and watching this producer who's been in the industry for, I think, 30 or 40 years, and his passion for learning about behavior and about the animals and comparing the two systems. That's who we need speaking about this stuff, not me. I mean, we just need more people like that talking out about it. And I think those messages that this is shades of gray will eventually get across.
Terrific. You have, we've gone around the horn here a little bit. Do you have any sort of final wrap-up comments that you want to pass on based on your experience, or encouragement to others that as we kind of reach the top of the hour here?
No, I guess I would just encourage, I think we're all in this together. I think there's very few of us that are in this for our ego or whatever. We're in this to really support and promote the social license of Canadian agriculture. So any opportunity we have to follow each other, support each other, stand up for each other like those people did for me on Twitter that day, which was absolutely huge. Let's just do that. And I think the more sincere, and we always talk about positive messaging, but let's just talk about sincere messaging coming out about Canadian agriculture. I think in the long run will be better and better, because the public is demanding transparency, and I think this is one of the many ways that we can deliver that.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for questions from people all across the country who've logged on here. As I think through the notes that I've been taking here, I really liked this idea of framing things in terms of a common core value, and the idea that sustainability is part of future generations, but that's more complicated than just a little bit of methane gas. That's about land use, and I also really liked your connection to there's places where you're comfortable telling the story and your personal approach to that. You don't want to get into a debate about a U.S. feedlot. That's not your experience to talk about. And then to encourage people to go to other sources of information. I found it really interesting you talking about vet students who had already formed opinions about animal welfare, negative ones, before they'd even had any experience in that game. And it reminds us very clearly that in the absence of our voice, somebody else wins the space, and that becomes the default opinion. And there needs to be some balance in that game. Thank you very much for the work that you do, and the story that you tell, and the encouragement that you've given to us, and some of the tips and tools on at least 3 of the hot buttons that you've identified for us.